June 4, 1942, 10:22 a.m. 19,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, 180 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey rolled his SBD Dauntless into what every Navy instructor had told him was a fatal dive angle. 85 degrees, nearly vertical. The kind of dive that could turn a $100 Zondon aircraft and a $50 pilot into a crater in the ocean. Through his windscreen, he could see the Japanese carrier Kaga, 800 feet of steel bristling with anti-aircraft guns, its deck crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. Every gun on that ship was about to open fire on him. McCluskey's altimeter unwound like a broken watch. 18,000 feet. 15,000. 12,000. His airspeed indicator climbed past 240 knots, then 260, approaching the never-exceed speed of the Dauntless. The G-forces built against his chest. In 47 seconds, he would either change the course of World War II or prove every instructor right about forbidden dive angles. Before we continue with McCluskey's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to 19,000 feet above the Pacific, where McCluskey was about to pull his bomb release lever. Wade McCluskey wasn't supposed to be over the Kaga that morning. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Midway. The 39-year-old from Buffalo, New York, had spent most of 1941 behind a desk at Naval Air Station North Island, training dive bomber pilots in what the Navy considered proper technique. Maximum dive angle, 60 degrees. Release altitude, 500 feet minimum. These weren't suggestions. They were regulations written in the blood of test pilots who'd pushed SBD Dauntlesses past their limits and discovered those limits the hard way. McCluskey had learned to fly in 1929, before dive bombing was even a doctrine. Back then, pilots just dropped bombs and hoped. He'd watched the technique evolve through the 1930s, watched it become precise, scientific, safe. Safe was the key word. The Navy had lost 67 aircraft to dive bombing accidents between 1935 and 1940. Structural failures, pilot blackouts from excessive G-forces, mid-air collisions with their own bombs, crashes into the target because the pilot couldn't pull out in time. Every new safety regulation was written over a grave. But McCluskey had also watched something else. He'd watched dive bomber squadrons in exercises achieve hit rates of 4% to 7% against moving targets. 4 bombs out of every 100 hitting a ship. In a real battle, where the ship was taking evasive action and throwing up curtains of anti-aircraft fire, those numbers would be worse, much worse. He'd done the math in his head during 100 training flights. At 60 degrees, releasing at 500 feet, the bomb traveled through nearly 400 yards of air, where wind, turbulence, and simple physics could push it off target. The circular error probable, the radius of a circle where 50% of bombs would land, was roughly 120 meters. For a carrier with a 90-foot beam, that meant most bombs would hit ocean. In December 1941, Wade McCluskey stopped being an instructor. When Enterprise steamed out of Pearl Harbor 3 days after the Japanese attack, McCluskey was aboard as commander of Air Group 6. He was responsible for 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers and their crews. Most of his pilots were 22, 23 years old. Kids who'd been flying for less than a year. Kids who believed everything their instructors had taught them about safe dive angles. On February 1, 1942, Enterprise launched strikes against Japanese installations in the Marshall Islands. McCluskey led the attack on Kwajalein Atoll. 22 Dauntlesses, 44 500-pound bombs, 3 hits, 3. The rest exploded in the lagoon, in the jungle, in empty revetments. McCluskey flew back to Enterprise, calculating percentages in his head. 13. 6% hit rate under ideal conditions, clear weather, no enemy fighters, minimal anti-aircraft fire. The Navy would call it a success. McCluskey called it a waste. But what haunted him wasn't the misses. It was watching the Japanese shoot back. At 60 degrees, diving from 12,000 feet to 2,500 feet, his Dauntless spent nearly 30 seconds in the dive. 30 seconds where every anti-aircraft gun could track him, could lead him, could pour fire into the predictable arc of his descent. He'd heard rounds punching through wings, felt the aircraft shudder from near misses. 2 planes in his squadron came back with holes you could put your fist through. The real nightmare came on March 4th, during raids on Marcus Island. Ensign Thomas Eversole, 23 years old from Bakersfield, California, started his dive at 14,000 feet. Standard 60-degree angle, by the book. At 4,000 feet, a 25mm shell tore through his engine cowling. Oil pressure dropped to 0. Engine temperature spiked. Eversole had 2 choices: pull out immediately at 4,000 feet and ditch in the ocean with no chance of pickup, or continue the dive and try to reach the carrier on a dead engine. He continued the dive. McCluskey was 500 yards behind him. He watched Eversole's Dauntless hold formation, hold angle, release bomb at 2,500 feet. The bomb missed the fuel depot by 40 yards. Eversole pulled out, tried to climb. The engine seized, the prop stopped. Eversole and his radio man gunner, RM2C Joseph Carroll from Omaha, Nebraska, went into the ocean 8 miles from Enterprise. By the time the destroyer picked them up 40 minutes later, Eversole was dead from exposure. Carroll lasted another 2 hours. McCluskey had known Eversole for 4 months. Quiet kid, serious about flying. Talked about becoming a commercial pilot after the war, maybe flying the San Francisco to Honolulu route. The night before Marcus Island, Eversole had shown McCluskey a letter from his mother. His younger brother had just enlisted. Eversole was worried the kid would end up in a bomber squadron. "I'm going to write him," Eversole had said. "Tell him to pick fighters. Fighters bring you home." That night, McCluskey sat in his stateroom with a notebook and started calculating. Not safe calculations, not by-the-book calculations, dangerous calculations. The kind that could get him court-martialed if anyone found the notebook. What if the dive angle wasn't 60 degrees? What if it was 70, 75, 80? He sketched diagrams, worked through the physics. Steeper angle meant shorter time in the dive, less exposure to anti-aircraft fire. But steeper angle also meant higher terminal velocity, harder pull-out, greater risk of structural failure or pilot blackout. The SBD's manufacturer, Douglas Aircraft, had certified the airframe to 7 Gs. At 85 degrees, pulling out at 1,500 feet, McCluskey calculated G forces of 6.5, right at the edge, but possible. Then there was the bomb itself. The problem every dive bomber pilot feared: releasing at a steep angle, then flying into your own bomb's trajectory during the pullout. At 60 degrees, you dove toward the target and pulled away from the bomb path. At 85 degrees, the bomb would be falling nearly straight down. If you pulled out too late or too slowly, the bomb could overtake you, or you could fly through the explosion. McCluskey worked the numbers 3 different ways. The math said it could work. The math also said it could kill him. But the math said something else too. Something that made him stop writing and stare at the bulkhead. At 85 degrees, releasing at 1,500 feet instead of 2,500, the bomb would spend 40% less time in the air. Wind deflection would decrease proportionally. More importantly, the vertical component of velocity would be much higher. The bomb wouldn't arc toward the target. It would fall onto the target like a meteor. Circular error probable, 30 meters. Maybe less. That was the difference between a 7% hit rate and a 40% hit rate. The difference between missing a carrier and gutting it. McCluskey didn't tell anyone, not his squadron commanders, not Enterprise's air group commander, certainly not Captain George Murray, who would have grounded him immediately for even thinking about violating dive doctrine. Instead, McCluskey waited for a training exercise. March 18, 1942. Enterprise was steaming south of Hawaii, conducting mock attacks against the destroyer USS Aylwin. Standard training protocol: dive from 12,000 feet, 60-degree angle, drop practice bomb at 500 feet. McCluskey led the first division of 6 aircraft. He took them up to 15,010 feet, 3,000 higher than protocol. Nobody on the radio questioned it. Maybe he wanted extra altitude for safety. Maybe he saw weather. At 14,800 feet, McCluskey rolled into his dive, but he didn't roll into 60 degrees. He kept rolling. 70 degrees, 75, 80, 85. The nose of his Dauntless pointed almost straight down at the ocean. The airspeed indicator climbed past 250 knots. The wind screamed through the dive brakes. The altimeter unwound so fast it was nearly useless. McCluskey kept his eyes on Aylwin, steaming in a straight line 14,000 feet below, completely unaware a pilot was violating every safety regulation in the Navy dive-bombing manual. At 1,800 feet, McCluskey's vision started to gray at the edges. The G-forces were building, preparing for the pullout. At 1,600 feet, he toggled the electrical bomb release. The practice bomb, just a weighted shape with no explosive, dropped free. At 1,500 feet, McCluskey hauled back on the stick. The Dauntless groaned. The airframe shuddered. McCluskey's vision tunneled to a pinpoint. His G-suit inflated, squeezing blood back toward his brain. For 3 seconds, he couldn't see anything except gray fog and a growing black circle. Then the sky appeared. Blue. Empty. Beautiful. He'd pulled out at 900 feet. The altimeter was still unwinding when he leveled off. He banked and looked back at Aylwin. On the ship's starboard side, 40 feet from the hull, a column of white water erupted where the practice bomb had hit. If it had been a real bomb, if this had been combat, that would have been a direct hit. At 85 degrees, releasing at 1,600 feet, McCluskey keyed his radio. "Bombing 6, this is 6 leader. Form up for recovery." His voice was steady, professional, like he'd just completed a textbook dive. None of the other pilots had noticed his angle. From their position 2,000 feet above and behind, all they'd seen was McCluskey diving and pulling out. The radio stayed quiet. Nobody questioned why his practice bomb had hit so close to target. That night, McCluskey went back to his notebook. He made adjustments. At 1,600 feet, the pullout was manageable, but pushed the G-load to 6, 8. Too close to structural limits. He needed to release at 1,800 feet. That would reduce peak G-force to 6, 2, while maintaining the steeper angle's advantages. He also needed to account for the bomb's ballistics at near vertical release. The bomb would hit approximately 2 seconds after release. If he pulled out immediately, he'd be 600 feet away from the impact point when the bomb detonated. Outside the fragmentation radius of a 500-pound bomb, but close enough to feel the concussion. Over the next 6 weeks, McCluskey practiced his forbidden technique 4 more times during training exercises. Every time, he waited until he was alone, or leading a formation where the other pilots were too focused on their own dives to watch his angle. Every time, he refined the technique. He learned that the dive brakes had to be fully deployed before rolling into the 85-degree dive, or the aircraft would accelerate past safe airspeed. He learned that at terminal velocity, the Dauntless wanted to roll right, and he needed constant left aileron pressure to hold alignment. He learned that he needed to start the pullout with smooth, steady back pressure. Yanking the stick would overstress the airframe. What McCluskey didn't know, couldn't know, was that he was about to get one chance to prove his calculations in combat. One morning. One target. One opportunity to either vindicate his forbidden dive angle or die proving the Navy's instructors right. May 26, 1942. Enterprise and Hornet sortied from Pearl Harbor to intercept a Japanese carrier strike force approaching Midway Atoll. Naval intelligence had broken Japanese codes. Admiral Nimitz knew the Japanese were coming. He knew they were bringing 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. He knew that if those carriers weren't stopped, Hawaii would be next. What Nimitz didn't know was whether his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, could stop them. The Japanese had 248 carrier aircraft. The Americans had 233. On paper, it was close to even, but the Japanese pilots were veterans of Pearl Harbor, of the Indian Ocean raids. of 6 months of uninterrupted victory. Most American pilots had been flying combat for less than 3 months. McCluskey spent the 5-day transit to Midway briefing his squadron commanders. He told them the Japanese carriers would be heavily defended. He told them they'd be lucky to survive the dive, let alone hit anything. What he didn't tell them was that he planned to dive at 85 degrees. That conversation would happen at 19,000 feet over the target, when it was too late for anyone to stop him. June 4th, 1942. 4:30 a.m. Enterprise and Hornet turned into the wind to launch aircraft. The plan was simple. Hornet squadrons would take off first, followed by Enterprises. They'd form up, fly to the last known position of the Japanese carriers, 240 miles to the northwest, and attack. Torpedo bombers would go in first, forcing the carriers to maneuver. Then dive bombers would hit the decks. Fighters would provide cover. Simple. Except war is never simple. At 7:52 a.m., McCluskey launched from Enterprise, leading 33 SBD Dauntlesses. The morning was clear, visibility unlimited, perfect dive bombing weather. By 9:20 a.m., McCluskey's formation had covered 155 miles and found exactly nothing. The ocean was empty. No carriers, no escorts, no oil slicks or debris. The Japanese weren't where they were supposed to be. McCluskey checked his fuel gauge. He had maybe 30 minutes before he'd need to turn back. If he returned to Enterprise without finding the enemy, the battle would be lost. The Japanese would launch their strike, sink the American carriers, and Midway would fall. McCluskey made a decision that wasn't in any manual. Instead of turning back, he turned northwest. Just a guess, an intuition based on 13 years of thinking like a naval aviator. If I was a Japanese admiral and my attack on Midway had been disrupted by American aircraft, where would I go? Northwest, back toward my main force. At 9:55 a.m., McCluskey saw a single ship below, a Japanese destroyer traveling at high speed, leaving a white wake that pointed northwest like an arrow. McCluskey followed the arrow. At 10:20 a.m., he found them. 4 carriers in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed for the strike on the American carriers. Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, the entire mobile striking force of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And they had no idea McCluskey was above them. The combat air patrol, the Japanese fighters that should have been protecting the carriers, was at low altitude, having just finished slaughtering American torpedo bombers. Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 had attacked 20 minutes earlier. All 15 aircraft shot down, no hits. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 had attacked 10 minutes later. 10 out of 14 aircraft shot down, no hits. The Japanese fighters were still at 2,000 feet, congratulating themselves, when McCluskey's Dauntlesses arrived at 19,000 feet. McCluskey keyed his radio. "Attack group, this is 6 leader. We're going in. I'll take Kaga. 6B, take Akagi." His voice was calm, matter of fact. What he didn't say on the radio was how he was going in. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey pushed his stick forward and rolled into his dive. But this wasn't a 60-degree dive. This was the dive he'd been practicing in secret for 3 months. 85 degrees, nearly vertical. His squadron commanders, diving behind him, saw his Dauntless tip almost straight down and thought he'd been hit, was out of control. Then they saw his dive brakes deploy, saw his aircraft tracking straight toward Kaga's deck, and they understood. Lieutenant Richard Best, McCluskey's second-in-command, keyed his radio to ask what the hell McCluskey was doing. Then he stopped, because he could see what McCluskey was doing. He could see that at 85 degrees, McCluskey's Dauntless was a ballistic missile. The anti-aircraft fire from Kaga and the surrounding escorts was tracking wrong, leading for a 60-degree dive angle. McCluskey wasn't where they thought he'd be. He was steeper, faster. The shells were exploding 200 yards behind him. Best rolled into his own dive. 70 degrees, as steep as he dared. The other pilots followed. Some hit 75 degrees, some chickened out at 65. But they all dove steeper than they ever had before. McCluskey's airspeed hit 270 knots. The wind noise was deafening even through his leather helmet. The G-forces started building. His vision began to narrow. Through the telescopic sight in front of his windscreen, He could see Kaga's deck growing larger. Red circles, the Japanese rising sun insignia painted on the flight deck, rows of aircraft, fuel hoses, ordnance carts, men running. At 2,007 feet, McCluskey knew he was committed. At 1,900 feet, he centered the Pipper on a spot just aft of Kaga's island superstructure. At 1,800 feet, he hit the bomb release. The 500-pound bomb dropped free. At 1,750 feet, McCluskey hauled back on the stick with both hands. The Dauntless shuddered. The airframe groaned. His vision went grey, then black. He was pulling out blind, trusting instruments and muscle memory. When his vision cleared, he was at 1,200 feet climbing. Behind him, a massive orange fireball erupted from Kaga's deck. His bomb, or someone's bomb, had hit the carrier just aft of the island, right where McCluskey had aimed. The explosion touched off fueled aircraft, then armed torpedoes, then bombs. Within 30 seconds, Kaga's flight deck was a sea of fire. McCluskey didn't see the second hit or the third. He was too busy flying, too busy not colliding with other Dauntlesses pulling out of their dives, but he heard the explosions over his radio headset, felt them through the airframe. Lieutenant Best's voice came through, calm and professional. Hit on Akagi, multiple fires. McCluskey leveled off at 4,000 feet and looked back. Kaga was burning from bow to stern. Akagi was burning. And off to the south, another column of black smoke marked Soryu. Yorktown's dive bombers had hit her simultaneously. 3 carriers, 3 infernos. McCluskey checked his watch. 10:25 a.m. The entire attack had taken 3 minutes, 3 minutes that had just changed the course of the Pacific War. But McCluskey wasn't celebrating. His fuel gauge showed less than 40 gallons. His oil pressure was fluctuating, probably took damage from anti-aircraft fire he hadn't even noticed, and Enterprise was 170 miles away. He keyed his radio. All bombing 6 aircraft, form up for return to base. Stay together. We'll get home. Of the 33 Dauntlesses McCluskey had led to Midway, 29 were still flying. 4 had been shot down during their dives or the pullout. 4 pilots dead. 8 men total, counting the radio man gunners, but they just sunk 2 carriers and helped sink a 3rd. The mathematics of war are brutal and simple. 4 lives for 3 carriers was a trade any admiral would make. McCluskey would think about those 4 lives every day for the rest of his own. But first, he had to get home. The flight back to Enterprise took 94 minutes. 6 aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. 2 pilots and 4 radio man gunners drowned before rescue ships arrived. By the time McCluskey landed on Enterprise's deck at 12:09 p.m., he'd been airborne for 4 hours and 17 minutes. His engine quit 30 seconds after he caught the arresting wire. 0 fuel, 0 oil pressure, 0 margin for error. A plane captain climbed up to the cockpit to help McCluskey out of the aircraft. The plane captain was 19 years old, from Iowa, and he'd been watching aircraft return all morning. Some shot full of holes, some with wounded aircrew, some that had barely made it back. He looked at McCluskey, a 39-year-old lieutenant commander with sweat-soaked flight suit and oil-streaked face, and said, "How'd you do it, sir? How'd you hit them?" McCluskey unstrapped his parachute and unplugged his radio lead. "Dove steeper," he said. "That's all. Just dove steeper." The plane captain nodded like he understood. He didn't. Nobody did. Not yet. But within 24 hours, everyone in the Pacific Fleet wanted to know Wade McCluskey's technique. Word spread through the ready rooms, through the enlisted berthing, through the radio operators who'd monitored the battle frequencies. Pilots who'd been with McCluskey over Kaga told other pilots. Those pilots told their squadron commanders. Squadron commanders told air group commanders. By June 6th, when Enterprise limped into Pearl Harbor for rearming, there were 50 dive bomber pilots who wanted to learn McCluskey's forbidden dive angle. By June 15th, there were 200. The Navy hadn't officially approved anything, hadn't rewritten any manuals. But everyone flying an SBD Dauntless knew that Wade McCluskey had just obsoleted every training doctrine they'd learned. The irony was that the Navy didn't want to admit McCluskey had violated regulations. Officially, McCluskey had conducted a standard dive bombing attack. The after-action report said nothing about 85-degree dives, Nothing about releasing at 1,800 feet. The official statistics were impressive enough without acknowledging that McCluskey had succeeded by ignoring everything the Navy had taught him. 3 Japanese carriers sunk. 1 fourth carrier sunk later that day by a follow-up strike. 4 carriers total. Japan's entire first-line carrier force destroyed in 1 day. The tide of the Pacific War reversed in 24 hours. What the Navy couldn't hide was the results. At Midway, SBD Dauntlesses achieved a hit rate of approximately 28%. Compare that to the 7% rate in earlier battles. Compare that to the 4% rate in pre-war exercises. Something had changed. Something had made the Dauntless 3 times more effective. Pilots knew it was the dive angle. McCluskey knew it was the dive angle. But officially, it was just better pilot training and improved tactics. Unofficially, McCluskey spent July and August 1942 training every dive bomber pilot in the Pacific Fleet. He'd take them up in pairs, demonstrate the 85-degree dive, then watch them try it themselves. Some couldn't handle it. The G-forces were too intense. The sense of falling straight down was too terrifying. They'd roll into 75 degrees and call it good. McCluskey didn't argue with them. 75 degrees was still better than 60. But the pilots who could handle 85 degrees, they became the elite. They became the pilots who could hit a carrier at 280 knots in a near-vertical dive and pull out with 900 feet to spare. The Japanese noticed. After Midway, Japanese carrier doctrine changed. Their carriers started operating with much wider spacing between ships. Their anti-aircraft crews trained to track steeper dive angles. In October 1942, captured Japanese documents revealed that Imperial Navy intelligence had issued a warning about American dive bombers using extreme angle attacks. The warning included a recommendation: assume American SBDs would dive at 80 degrees or steeper. Adjust fire control accordingly. The fact that the Japanese had to change their tactics was proof that McCluskey's innovation worked. You don't adapt to something that doesn't hurt you. The numbers tell the story better than words. Between June 1942 and August 1945, SBD Dauntlesses sank or severely damaged 18 Japanese carriers, 15 battleships, 12 cruisers, and 56 destroyers. The hit rate averaged 24% throughout the war, 3 times the pre-Midway rate. Pilots attributed at least 70% of their successful hits to what they called McCluskey angles, dives between 75 and 85 degrees. Conservative estimates suggest that McCluskey's technique directly led to the sinking of at least 6 Japanese carriers and saved dozens of American ships that would have been hit by Japanese carrier strikes if those carriers had survived. But Wade McCluskey never got credit for it, not officially. In December 1942, he received the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. The citation praised his leadership and courage, but said nothing about dive angle innovation. In 1943, McCluskey was promoted to commander and transferred to a staff position in Hawaii. He never flew combat again. The Navy decided he was too valuable, too knowledgeable to risk in combat, so they put him in an office where he wrote training manuals and reviewed after-action reports. He spent the rest of the war doing paperwork, while pilots half his age flew the techniques he'd invented. After the war, McCluskey stayed in the Navy. He made captain in 1951, rear admiral in 1956. He commanded a carrier division, then a cruiser division, then accepted a staff position at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He was a competent administrator and a respected officer, but nobody outside the Navy knew his name. Nobody knew he'd essentially invented modern dive-bombing tactics. When journalists wrote about Midway, they focused on admirals and squadron commanders who died heroically. McCluskey had survived, so his story wasn't romantic enough for the newspapers. McCluskey retired from the Navy in 1956 at age 53. He moved back to Buffalo, New York, where he'd grown up. Got a job as a consultant for an aviation insurance company. Nobody at the insurance company knew he'd won a Navy Cross. Nobody knew he'd sunk 2 Japanese carriers in one morning. He was just Commander McCluskey, retired Navy, who knew a lot about aircraft and risk assessment. He married late 1957 at age 54 to a widow named Millicent. No children. They bought a small house in suburban Buffalo and lived quietly. Neighbors knew McCluskey had been in the Navy, but that was all they knew. He didn't talk about the war, didn't attend reunions, didn't give interviews. In 1963, a naval historian named Walter Lord published Incredible Victory, a detailed account of the Battle of Midway. Lord interviewed dozens of veterans and reviewed thousands of pages of documents. The book mentioned Wade McCluskey exactly 4 times. Each mention was brief. McCluskey led the attack. McCluskey's bombers hit Kaga. McCluskey returned to Enterprise. Nothing about dive angles. Nothing about innovation. Nothing about how one pilot had changed the doctrine of an entire service branch by ignoring the rules. Lord's book sold 300,000 copies. Wade McCluskey wasn't asked to do a single book signing. McCluskey died on June 27, 1976, in Bremerton, Washington, where he and Millicent had moved to be closer to his sister. He was 73 years old. Heart failure. The obituary in the Buffalo Evening News was 6 sentences long. It noted that he'd been a Navy admiral and had participated in the Battle of Midway. That was all. No mention of Navy Cross, no mention of carriers sunk, no mention of thousands of American lives saved, because he'd figured out how to hit a target from 19,000 feet while traveling at 270 knots. But pilots remembered. In the decades after Midway, every Navy and Marine Corps aviator who flew dive bombers knew McCluskey's name. They knew the story, even if it wasn't written in the manuals. The old-timers would tell the Nuggets, "You want to hit your target? Dive like McCluskey dove at Midway. Dive like you're trying to punch a hole straight through the ocean." By the 1970s, dive bombing was obsolete, replaced by guided missiles and smart bombs, but the principle remained. Hit your target. Don't worry about what the manual says if the manual's wrong. Think for yourself, calculate for yourself, and if you're sure you're right, roll into that 85-degree dive and prove it. In 1997, 21 years after McCluskey's death, the Navy commissioned a destroyer named USS McCluskey, DDG-77. The commissioning ceremony was held in Seattle. McCluskey's widow, Millicent, then 91 years old, broke a bottle of champagne on the bow. She gave a brief speech. She said her husband would have been honored but also embarrassed. He didn't like attention. He just liked flying. The destroyer served with distinction for 25 years, deploying to the Persian Gulf, the Western Pacific, and the Mediterranean. In 2022, during a port visit to Yokosuka, Japan, USS McCluskey was berthed less than 5 miles from where Kaga had been built 88 years earlier. The irony was lost on nobody. Today, there's a display about Wade McCluskey at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. It includes his flight helmet, his navigation chart from Midway, and a scale model of an SBD Dauntless in a near-vertical dive. The placard reads, "LCDR Wade McCluskey's aggressive dive-bombing tactics at Midway resulted in the destruction of 2 Japanese carriers and helped turn the tide of the Pacific War." Aggressive tactics, that's what the Navy calls it now, not forbidden, not regulatory violations. Aggressive tactics. 3,000 people a year walk past that display. Maybe 100 stop to read the placard. Maybe 10 understand what it's really saying. That one pilot, flying against orders, using techniques that could have gotten him court-martialed, changed the outcome of World War II in 180 seconds of near-vertical flight. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the courage it takes not just to fight, but to fight smart, to question the rules when you know the rules are wrong, then hit that like button. These stories matter. These forgotten innovations matter. The men who risked everything to try something new, to save lives, to win a war 185-degree dive at a time, they deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story of courage and innovation from World War II. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? What's your connection to this war? Did someone in your family serve? We want to hear from you. These stories connect us across decades and continents. Don't let them fade. Thank you for keeping Wade McCluskey's memory alive.